With the reigning defending defensive player of the year at cornerback, Patrick Surtain, this is one position group that is set for Denver in 2025. We'll overlay what that room looks like and more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more that you get every single day, all year long, even throughout the entire offseason. This is the place to be. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day, however you choose to do so. And hey, if you're not an everydayer, it's super easy to become one. All you have to do is hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on your favorite Broncos podcast out there, Locked On Broncos. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter here from Mile High Sports. You can check out my work over there, milehighsports.com. Joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, the longtime site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com, where you can check out his written work there every single day. And look, Broncos Country, the NFL draft is still fast approaching here. And what you're going to get on today's episode of the show is a little bit of a position overview after free agency. Will the Broncos continue their streak of adding a player in the NFL draft here in 2025? We'll debate and discuss that. We'll also talk about and debate whether or not the Broncos should look at adding a veteran cornerback to the mix of what we believe is already a set position here on this team. But we're going to kick things off today by highlighting that cornerback group and where the Broncos truly are at with the youth movement there, led by veteran Patrick Surtain. So, Sayre, this is a position group, obviously, in free agency. The Broncos, they didn't go out there and make any moves at cornerback. They could have, right? There are a handful of guys available. We'll dive into that later on the show. But really, it seems like, hey, we're locked in here, pun intended, with Patrick Surtain, Riley Moss, Jaquan McMillian, Damari Mathis, Kris Abrams-Draine. The Broncos, they have a pretty loaded group right now of players I think can contribute at a high level for them.
Yeah, and I think if they had brought Tremont Smith back in free agency, which we know they tried to do, and then, of course, replaced him with Trent Sherfield at the wide receiver position, I think if they had brought Tremont back, I don't know if there would be any real even inkling of an opening at this position. And this is one of those spots to where I think you can comfortably go into the NFL draft thinking to yourself, if you're George Paton, Sean Payton, obviously, secondary coach and defensive pass game coordinator Jim Leonard, you can feel really, really good about the group that you have. You've got a great mixture of young guys who are now developing into veterans like Pat Surtain, who is the elder statesman of the group at this point. And I think that should give this team such a confidence, like to build in the trenches up front, right? That's what I think having a strong cornerback room does for you, is really it allows you to go into the draft saying, how can we make our cornerbacks better? Because we already have the guys. How can we make them better? We can get pass rushers. We can go out and get guys who can hurry up the clock for the opposing quarterback. You've already got guys at this position group who can make plays on the football, who exhibit that toughness, that physicality that you so desperately need at the position nowadays, especially what we saw from Riley Moss and Pat Surtain in run support, and certainly Jaquan McMillian blitzing every so often. These guys have the full arsenal of skills, I think, on top of just, saying, well, we've got the position group set, right? Or we feel really good about the guys that we have. They've all got that skill set that you desperately look for at the cornerback position. And the Broncos may have, even a guy that's going to be sitting on the bench, a little bit more than others this year, who's potentially a starting caliber guy as well.
And I'm excited to see how the additions of Talanoa, Hufanga, Greenlaw, like these guys are obviously big-time additions that are going to make that defense even better, right? And I think specifically with the addition of Greenlaw, having a linebacker who can sit back there and cover anything crossing in the middle of the field and can go out there and maybe drop a little bit deeper. You can blitz him. Like, he is a guy that will help. Certainly, I think the Broncos overcome those issues on crossing patterns that we saw in that final stretch of 5 games last season there. That's going to help out your corners there. But then you wrapped it up with your pass rush that already led the NFL last season with 63 total sacks. Obviously, we expect some extensions coming from maybe Nick Bonito, Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers potentially here. But you're bringing that unit back, that helps you get to where you are. And your ability to get after quarterbacks, obviously, that's going to be huge. But what really limited that production later in the season was discrepancies on the inside, at the inside linebacker position, in terms of teams hitting those crossing patterns there, identifying quarterbacks who, get the ball out of their hands quickly when they know a guy is blitzing. You have the number one rule you always say is throw against the blitz, right? If you got a nickel blitz to your left side and an inside linebacker blitzing as well, hey, you're throwing where the blitz is coming because there's vacated area, there's vacated grass over there. So Drake Greenlaw, I think, is going to give that, guys like Riley Moss, Jaquan McMillian a little bit more help. Pat Surtain, he's a weapon in and of itself. He's the great equalizer here. But I want to focus here on Riley Moss for a second, because coming into the offseason, we've seen some Broncos fans say that they're not comfortable with Denver's cornerback depth. I honestly, I will disagree with that. I feel good about it. For Riley Moss, of course, everyone's going to go back to that Cincinnati Bengals game. First game back off the knee injury. Obviously he still wasn't his best self yet, but the catches he gave up against T. Higgins, you can maybe make an argument, maybe one of those he absolutely got torched on. The other ones are T. Higgins making a great play with Riley still being in pretty close position to be able to make a play there. T just made a better one against him. That's the life of a cornerback here. I'm not worried in any way, shape, or form about Riley Moss. How do you feel about him, especially as we now get to see him really coming into year 2 as a true full-time starter?
Even putting aside my Iowa Hawkeyes bias for a moment, Cody, I feel like Riley Moss had a really good first year as a starter for this Denver Broncos defense. And you see it just in spades all over the place. What Sean Payton has said, and what we repeat on this podcast a lot of times, that confidence is bred from demonstrated ability. And what Riley Moss did last year is play extremely well for long stretches of time and fail forward in others. I don't think there was anything that we saw from Riley Moss last year that was indicative of things that we had seen like early in the careers of guys like Isaac Yiadom, where it was, you might have to upgrade at that position, or Michael Ojemudia, where you're like, I mean, I know we spent a 3rd round pick on the guy, but I don't think we can bank on him being a starter. Damari Mathis, even in the 2022 season, getting an opportunity. I don't think there was any real, this guy should be a number 1 or number 2 corner in the NFL after his, first season as a starter. But with Riley Moss, I think it's a completely different story. I think we truly did see top tier cornerback traits from him. And I don't understand why that can't be just okay. After it's his first year as a starter. It's not just, convincing yourself that, okay, well, I'll talk myself into Riley Moss. I think there's no projecting that happens. I think if you're not an all-pro or a Pro Bowl guy, or if you're not, ranking number 1 on Pro Football Focus's lists or whatever, I think a lot of times the fan perception or the armchair analyst perception is that, well, the guy wasn't good enough. Obviously, he didn't play at an all-pro level. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of projecting that has to happen, and teams putting faith in guys, just like last year at this time, when I think it was fair to question, like, is Riley Moss somebody that you just put faith in because he didn't play as a rookie? So I get the hesitation then, but now there's proof of concept over long stretches of time in NFL games, real NFL games of him playing well. So I don't think there's any need for the Broncos to convince themselves of a lie in that, oh, well, I don't know if Riley Moss was necessarily good enough. I think that's just kind of fear mongering for the sake of doing so.
Yeah, and look, I think if you look at Riley's tape, what does he do? He could play man coverage. He could play zone coverage. He comes up and tackles. He's not afraid to get involved with contact. Like, that's the thing I like about Riley, is Riley can do a little bit of everything here for that, and he's not afraid of the moment. Like, that's the one thing I'll say about Riley is, he's been put in some situations where it's, hey, you got to go make a play, and he has made some plays there. I think the knee injury definitely derailed him a little bit, because for anyone that's ever played cornerback, which it's hard. Like, I did that. I tore my ACL, tried to come back and play the next year. I couldn't do it. I didn't have the same confidence. And when you have a knee injury, you're always just thinking like, hey, am I good? Am I going to plant right? Like, all the stuff that he has to do from that position, to being able to plant, cut, backpedal, T-step, which is a big argument on social media that we're now seeing these days, which is, funny. But Riley's not afraid of that. And I had a chance to talk to Riley after that Bengals game, and he still had nothing but, confidence in himself. Teammates had confidence in him. And I can tell you the coaches have confidence in Riley Moss. George Paton does. Sean Payton does. His cornerback coach, Addison Lynch, who's done a tremendous job with that room as well. they have nothing but trust in Riley Moss. And I think that we're going to see things formulate a little bit more. He's going to have a bigger role this upcoming season. Jaquan McMillian inside the nickel. And then, you got guys like Damari Mathis who are kind of in a little bit of a prove-it year at this point. Can he find a way to make it on the field in some packages? That's something we're going to keep our eyes on here. But Broncos country, the room at cornerback is young, and we're going to ask ourselves whether or not the Broncos should add a veteran guy. Is there a veteran that makes sense here for Denver to add before the NFL draft? We'll take a look at that and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. The same thing applies to concert events that are going on, and I'm excited in particular about the month of June at Empower Field at Mile High. Metallica is coming to town for a 2-night, no-repeat set list. You know me, I'm a diehard Metallica fan. If you know me, if you truly know me here, and Game Time gives you the best opportunity to get the best deals on seats to that event or any sporting events that are going on in your area. And they also have Game Time Picks, which curates and makes it easy to find the better value for tickets to sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and anything else going on in your area. And they have super deals like the lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And you can also see what your vantage point of the event you're going to is going to be like with seat views inside the app. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
Is there any sort of need for the Denver Broncos to bring in a veteran cornerback in 2025? Well, I don't know. The debacle that was Levi Wallace against the Cleveland Browns last year just might prevent the Broncos from going after any sort of similar path, but you never know when there could be a steal available in NFL free agency, Broncos country. So we're going to discuss today whether or not a veteran corner is necessary on this episode, Locked On Broncos. But first of all, I want to say thank you to every single one of you out there that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. And if you haven't done so already, Cody and I, we'd really appreciate it if you take a couple seconds, hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts as well as on YouTube, because we got you covered every single day here on the show. Cody, let's talk about a veteran corner for the Denver Broncos right now. Obviously, where things sit with the depth chart currently, I don't know. I mean, are you talking about the sixth best player on the roster at most, maybe fifth, if you want to really split hairs over Damari Mathis right now? I think that we didn't talk much about Kris Abrams-Draine in segment one, but he factors into this discussion as well. 3 more years on his rookie deal. The Broncos have been super, super successful drafting guys and finding guys on the undrafted free agent heap that it's hard for me to maybe even justify a back end of the roster corner veteran signing right now.
Yeah, look, I'm not on board with necessarily bringing in a veteran corner at this point. I think you continue to go with the youth movement, right? You've upgraded linebacker, you've upgraded, obviously, the safety position, and you got some young guys all across the board that already contribute. The Broncos defense doesn't really have, I think, right now a hole more so than they do a question mark, and that really comes at inside linebacker. But should we maybe, wander into the deep waters of what happens if there is an injury to either a Pat Surtain, a Jaquan McMillian, or a Riley Moss again here? Because when that did happen to Riley Moss, Levi Wallace got thrown into the mix here. And obviously we saw how that kind of transpired in that Cleveland game. He had one of the worst games of his career, and it led to him ultimately being cut by the Broncos here. To me, I don't think that was necessarily, okay, you got a veteran guy, that's the reason it happened. I think more so it was, you had a guy that I just don't feel like fit the scheme of being able to play man at a consistent rate against some of the other top guys. Like when you're facing a team that has loaded wide receiver rooms, you have to be able to play man-to-man coverage at times. And I don't feel like that was a strength of Levi Wallace. But for me, that's also on the coaching staff. That was a little bit on Vance Joseph for them saying, hey, you know what, we're going to go with the veteran guy here. I understand the safety net of going with the veteran guy. And I understand Vance Joseph at times has hesitancy to maybe hand the keys to a rookie here. But what do we see from Kris Abrams-Draine in that Cleveland game? He got put in on the final drive and was covering Jerry Jeudy. and was in good position. And we saw him against the Los Angeles Chargers pick off Justin Herbert. Like Kris Abrams-Draine, to me, showcased enough last year where he was playing that I'm like, if there is an injury, I'm okay with this guy stepping in. Like Abrams-Draine is a guy that I think was a little bit more NFL ready than people thought. And some people were surprised by how he played last year. I wasn't. I mean, I was kind of on that train a little bit from the onset, throughout the entire preseason process here with Abrams-Draine. But if the Broncos add a veteran, Sayre, they have to add a guy that maybe fits the traits of what you want to do from a scheme standpoint. And what does that mean? That means that you have to be able to play zone coverage, which a lot of teams run zone, but you have to be able to play man coverage. And that is the opportunity cost here, because there are some corners who excel in zone, struggle in man. There are corners who can do both. And then there's guys who just, maybe struggle in zone because it's a little bit more read and react versus just, hey, I'm going to read the hips of this guy. I'm going to follow him wherever he goes. Some guys are really good at that. The free agent market right now in terms of guys available is very interesting to me, Sayre, because I don't know if there's anyone that's a necessary fit for what the Broncos want to bring in at this point. I mean, you could look at former Buffalo Bill, former Baltimore Raven Tre'Davious White, who at one point was really good. But at what point, like, are you bringing in a veteran guy here to steal reps away from a guy like Kris Abrams-Draine, who's, was taken with the premium pick, and the Broncos, they view him as a guy who can play for them. You've got Riley Moss. You've got Jaquan McMillian. You've got Pat Surtain. To me, I don't think you need to add to this room at all. And the veteran list of guys is not that high. I'd say Tre'Davious White being one as a veteran guy, probably a low-end veteran signing. But I'm still surprised at this point that a guy like Asante Samuel Jr., former AFC West division rival with the Chargers, I'm surprised he's a free agent still. I'm surprised he has not landed with any other team.
Yeah, he's the most shocking name, I think, on the list as of right now. When you look at just his age, what he's done in the past, and kind of where teams usually are willing to invest in NFL free agency. Maybe he's just waiting for the exact right fit, or maybe the dollar amount is not quite where he wants it to be. But whatever the case may be, I think if we're playing devil's advocate here for a second, my opinion is that the Broncos could upgrade the competition in the slot for Jaquan McMillian. I know they have guys on the roster that could potentially vie for playing time there. McMillian had a number of penalties last year. I think that, you're willing to live with stuff with young guys because they're young guys and you want them to grow and you want them to play and fail forward. And so it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things unless it continues. But I believe he was maybe the league leader or among the league leaders in defensive holding or pass interference or both last season. And so maybe the Broncos do want to say like, hey, let's bring in some competition for this guy because he's now in a contract year. So not only is he competing against himself to get a new contract, but he's competing against somebody like Asante Samuel Jr. and really having to earn his roster spot or earn his role with the team again. And I think that brings out the best in everybody, doesn't it? And so it's one of those things to where if you have a chance to like truly upgrade and you feel like it's a clear step above what you currently have, he would be the one guy that I would say, okay, in the draft or free agency, you might be able to actually find somebody that could do that job a little bit better. But I mean, again, that's kind of just playing devil's advocate at this point.
Well, I'm going to be the guy the angry old man yelling at the clouds. I felt like a lot of the penalties last year, there were a couple that were like clear-cut penalties. But I felt like Jaquan McMillian got unfairly penalized on some things. Like, how I feel about the NFL's rules towards defensive players. You got to have as much right. That's why I'm all in favor of the Detroit Lions proposal to eliminate that illegal contact being an automatic first down. I hope that passes because it's ridiculous. Like if it's 3rd and 20 and you have an illegal contact, you're playing zone coverage and your corner gets called for, rerouting a guy across the field to be able to get into his zone. I hate that. It's an unfair advantage, for the offensive side of the ball. And if it's 3rd and 20, now all of a sudden becomes an automatic first down by default. I hate that. It drives me up a wall. I felt like Jaquan McMillian, a lot of the penalties that were called on him last year, I felt like were ticky-tack at times. There were a few clear ones there. I also felt like Pat Surtain got a pretty awful whistle at times last season as well. I wasn't a big fan of that, but I'm going to continue to yell and be the angry old man yelling at the clouds when it comes to that. I'm a huge advocate for making defense great again in the National Football League. Allow defensive players to be able to lock up. They got the toughest position in football, in my opinion, having to cover the fastest dudes who can change directions at any minute, and they're doing it while going backwards. So my little rant is going to be, kind of end right there. But I personally don't believe that the Broncos should go out there and add a veteran cornerback. I think you also have another contract year here for Damari Mathis, whereas Sayre, I think if you're really looking at, he played in that dime last year for the Broncos. So if you're looking to add competition for Jaquan McMillian, why not allow Damari Mathis to maybe play that role? Because it is very clear at this point that Pat Surtain, Riley Moss, these two guys are going to be on the outside. Damari, he's got a chip on his shoulder. I've talked to Damari. He was disappointed he didn't win the competition last year, and he got hurt, obviously, in that final preseason game. But this is a guy who wants to get on the field and is willing to do whatever it takes to do so. So if that means maybe playing inside the slot a little bit more, he may, in fact, do that. Also, on special teams, this is going to be a little bit of a differentiating factor for who gets a 53-man roster spot because of the nature you lose Tremont Smith. Now there's an opening there. So Kris Abrams-Draine, Damari Mathis, those guys competing for some special teams reps as well. And maybe even Abrams-Draine is going to compete a little bit for inside, though I feel like he's going to be better suited on the outside here for the Broncos. So we'll see how things pan out here. But Broncos country, I want to ask you as always, do you think that the team should add a veteran cornerback here before the NFL draft or after the NFL draft to this room? What's your level of comfort with corner? Make sure you let us know here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But we're not done yet, Broncos country. We still got a lot to break down on today's episode of the show. Since George Paton has taken over as the team's GM, there has been a streak of cornerbacks taken in the NFL draft. Will that streak continue here in 2025? We'll debate and discuss on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Will the Denver Broncos continue their streak of adding a cornerback in the NFL draft? After adding Kris Abrams-Draine last year, are the Broncos comfortable with their room, or do they want to continue to add young players who might be able to continue to develop as the team gets older at that position in the years ahead? We'll discuss that here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. I want to say thank you once again to everyone in Broncos country for tuning in, making us your first listen. Thanks to all the everydayers out there. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, let's continue on here today. Obviously, the NFL draft since George Paton has come along. They've added, a handful of corners. You go back to George Paton's first draft with the team, 2021. You land All-Pro Defensive Player of the Year, Patrick Surtain II with the 9th overall pick. 2022 comes around. You end up landing Damari Mathis out of Pitt. 2023 comes around. You don't necessarily go with that because of your limited capital. And then 2024, last year, we saw them take Kris Abrams-Draine, obviously with a pick out of Mizzou. So just a comfort level on taking in young guys that they feel like can develop well. And I think so far they've been on a pretty good path. Damari Mathis kind of littered a little bit with injuries throughout his career, some inconsistencies. But I'd say for the most part, cornerback has been one area I feel like George Paton, and I think even Sean Payton feels like, hey, we want to continue to add youth to this position.
Yeah, 2023, even they traded up for Riley Moss. So there's
yeah.
definitely every year since George has been in town, they've gone after a corner in the draft. And I think it was Kerry Vincent in 2021. They doubled up at
the Eagles.
Position. So yeah, then traded him to the Eagles. So it's one of those things that's like Vic Fangio I think he said at one point, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, basically there's 96 starting cornerback jobs in the NFL with how much teams play in the nickel at this point. And he said, there ain't 96 starting caliber corners in the league. And that's why you continually load up at the position. And when he was talking about that was after, remember the Broncos had, I think, they had Bryce Callahan, Kyle Fuller, Ronald Darby. Like they had all these free agents and all these guys that they had added to the team. And then they draft Pat Surtain, shockingly. And everybody's like, what are you doing? You just got all these guys. And now how thankful are we that they still made that decision to draft PS2 as opposed to just thinking they were good with those other guys. So maybe something to think about, Broncos country, as we get into the final, stretch here of mock draft season. If you feel like they're set at a current position, where can they get a blue chip talent? But I think with this streak that we're on, Cody, I don't see it ending. I don't think there's any way the Broncos will come away from the 2025 NFL draft without taking a cornerback, because this is one of those positions where obviously their scouting department has been nails. I think the guys that they've picked have been really good. Like even Damari Mathis, I would say, is mostly injury related to why he hasn't stepped into a bigger role at this point. But I mean, you look at, obviously Pat Surtain's resume speaks for itself. Riley Moss, that pick is looking like a hit. Kris Abrams-Draine pick is looking like a hit. So I think there's no doubt that you trust your guys that are scouting this position and say, hey, We feel like in the 6th round, even, we can get a guy here who could potentially play in the slot, can play some special teams. He's going to make the 53. And if you're whoever's evaluating DBs for this team, whoever's scouting them, if it's George Paton himself, I think you're sitting there saying, all right, we're going to go with what this guy says or what this gal says, because obviously like they're hitting it every single year out of the park.
Well, I know there's also been some mock drafts that have had Denver going with the cornerback with Will Johnson out of Michigan at 20th overall, which, I mean, on paper, that'd be a fun addition. But as we've said, the Broncos, they have more pressing needs where they can add a very high quality player on the offensive side of the ball. Because, look, I think the defense, I think they're in really, really good shape right now going into the NFL draft. I think they're in better shape going into the season at this point than they were last year on paper. That defense got drastically better. And we had a lot of question marks going about that defense and about Vance Joseph going into year number 2 in his system after, was that streak that they had where they forced all those turnovers and had that 5-game win streak, was that a fluke? Well, it turns out it was not a fluke. The Broncos defense actually started playing legit. Now they started to transform their playmakers at different levels of the football defensively. And you start to bring in young guys to develop, and it gives you an idea like, hey, you have flexibility. Because Sayre, I think the challenge of managing an NFL roster today is always trying to think like, how can we address what we need now and how to be good at certain positions now, while also not ignoring that position down the road. Like, that's why you always have to get younger guys, because you are an injury away, you're a retirement away, or you're just one move not panning out from being like, hey, this might put us in a rough position. And then when you factor in contract extensions, like look at what teams like the Cincinnati Bengals kind of put themselves into. They waited so long to get a jump on extending guys like Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Trey Hendrickson, that they're paying really ridiculous market value when they could have gotten an extension done that's probably a little more team friendly earlier if they had made that a priority there. So it's a balancing act of trying to figure out how to manage your salary cap in that regard, understanding like, hey, we're good at this position, but we also need to be mindful. Like, unless we have 2 guys that are, lamb locked into being cornerback 1, cornerback 2, this is a position teams will always bring in another guy because, hey, you suffer one injury, and you see how many wide receivers teams have in today's NFL. We see how many times you see 3-by-1 sets or empty formations. It's like, hey, you got to have 3 or 4 guys that can cover, and you have to have good guys on the back end of your secondary at safety. So to me, this is a position I feel like you can never go wrong adding young guys here in the NFL draft. And I even think adding undrafted rookie free agents to come in and do some things as well. Like, you need that type of depth there. You can stash guys on your practice squad that can develop a little bit more. And I think that's a huge emphasis. I think that's so important here for what George Paton. I think what Sean also values too is good cornerback play and needing those guys. I think that's why he really couldn't hide last year during training camp how he felt about Riley Moss. And I'm just excited to see how this position room continues to grow. Like I said, I think that the cornerback coach, Addison Lynch, has done a tremendous job working with these guys. It helps when you have a guy like Pat Surtain. It helps when you have a guy like Riley Moss. But this is a smart room. They have smart coaches. They have smart defensive coordinator in Vance Joseph. They have a smart head coach in Sean Payton, and knows how to find the best players available that fit what they want to do from an identity standpoint. To me, Denver can only get better at this position, which they don't need to right now. It's a strength, in my opinion, of theirs.
It is. And it's one of those position groups to where, I mean, yeah, you could justify taking best player available if that's the case at 20 overall, like you mentioned, Will Johnson or Jedi Barron from Texas as well, who's some people's cornerback 1 in this class. And you could justify it and say like, yeah, you can never have too many good corners. And look what it did for us to draft Pat Surtain when it seemed like we didn't have a need at that position. But at the same time, it feels way more like a luxury at this point. And it's a luxury that, it's nice to know that even though the Broncos' top 2 positions on the roster, according to Sean Payton and George Paton last year, were offensive and defensive line, I'd be willing to bet cornerback wasn't far behind, because those guys played extremely well for where they're at in their careers, and the faith that was put in them by this coaching staff to say, look, we're not going to go out and sign anybody but Levi Wallace. Like, we're going to let Riley Moss and Jaquan McMillian play, and we're going to let Kris Abrams-Draine play. The faith that was put in those guys was rewarded. And I think that's the kind of like thing that what gets rewarded gets repeated, right? So the Broncos, I think they're going to take that same tactic and strategy into this year. So I would say as early as the 4th round, but probably not earlier than the 4th round for corner, if I had to guess today.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I think that the first three picks, I think that their first three picks on the top 100 are going to be offense, which I think it should be offense. Load up at running back, tight end, maybe add a receiver to the mix. Then I think you can focus on adding defensive guys with the remaining back end capital that you have. Will the Broncos make any draft day trades? I mean, that's certainly a possibility. We've seen them do that with other teams. I think really 2 years in a row. Like Sean Payton first year traded with the Saints to get Adam Troutman. In year number 2, they traded with the New York Jets to get John Franklin Myers. I imagine we're going to see another draft day trade this upcoming season. So 4 weeks away, Broncos country. There's going to be a lot of action involved here, but we're going to continue our position overview after NFL free agency. We broke down the cornerback room here today, but are the Broncos comfortable with their pass rush room at outside linebacker set as is, or could they add a spark by bringing home a familiar face? We'll break that down and much more on tomorrow's episode. Locked on Broncos, Broncos country. We'll see you then.